Douglas Murray joins us once again here today. He's a Fox News contributor. He is a deep thinker, and I always love talking to him. Thanks for being here, Douglas.
Great to be with you. Great to see you, Will.
You know, I want to start actually with current events. You had a speaking event scheduled in London where you intended to do, as you have very often over the last several months and years, as a matter of fact, address the situation in Israel. You were interrupted by pro-Palestinian protesters. You were met, in essence, with a version of the modern-day cancellation mob. I'm curious what you think about what Dr. Drew had to say to me earlier about this mob mentality, and that it is not, while it might be unique in our lifetimes, it's not unique historically. He drew the climate parallel, Douglas, to the mindset that existed in revolutionary France. I'm curious what you think about today as compared to the past in France.
That's a very interesting place to start. You know, when the revolution began in Paris in 1789, the king was woken up. King Louis XVI was woken up eventually by one of the members of his court. There was much discussion about whether they should wake the king, and if so, who should do it. It's said that what happened was that they woke him up, and the king said, when they said there's a revolution in Paris, he said, no, it's a disturbance. Now that, you see, there'd been a lot of disturbances in Paris, but he said it's a disturbance and effectively wanted to go back to sleep. And the courtier said, no, Your Majesty, it's a revolution. Now, one of the interesting things about that story is, of course, is that the word revolt, the word revolution, would have sounded very different to Louis XVI's ear than it does to ours today. And there's a reason for that, of course, which is that all revolutions that we speak of today, we mean that they are things that are in the shadow of the events of 1789 in France. And that's one of the reasons why the king had such difficulty comprehending the scale of exactly what was coming to him. By then, of course, it was far too late, and everyone knows what happened afterwards. But effectively, the king ended up isolated, hidden away in Versailles, eventually arrested, eventually guillotined, and his wife, the queen, of course, eventually guillotined as well. But what's interesting in a way about the origins of the French Revolution, one of the many things that's interesting about it, as I say, is it's effectively the prism through which we look at all such events subsequently. The moment when the society starts to turn over completely, when neighbor can turn upon neighbor or the street upon the king. And of course, to Louis's ears, it was also something incomprehensible, because although, of course, 100 years earlier in Britain, in England, the king had been executed, the idea of monarchs losing their heads, the idea of monarchs losing their thrones, was something that would rock all of Europe and indeed the whole world. And you mentioned the American Revolution. One of the fascinating things, one of my unending admiration for the founding fathers, an admiration which seems to be being lost in America these days, but one of my unending reasons for admiration of the founding fathers is that what they were trying to do at the same time in America was only really being tried in one other place in the world, and that was revolutionary France. And whereas the revolutionaries, of course, in France ended up losing control, the people who toppled the king ended up going to the guillotine themselves, Robespierre and co., and then France went into the terrors. America managed to avoid this. America actually managed to avoid the terror. And I'm not sure still that enough Americans realize the sheer genius of the founding fathers in making sure that this experiment, which had only been tried in one other place, didn't go to the place that France did.
When everyone thinks about revolutions, these two revolutions, Douglas, are at the top of their mind, America and France. One, to those in the know, understand that the American Revolution is a great historical success. It's an advancement. It's not just, we managed to overthrow the king, but we managed to create a society that's led to more freedom and prosperity, where that is not par for the course in revolutions. And for those in the know, the French Revolution is largely understood as a failure, not just because the revolutionaries themselves ended up in the guillotine, but the only thing that seemed to then unify France afterwards was a great authoritarian power in Napoleon, some 5, 6, 7 years later. I'm curious, what is the ingredient that made America a success and made France a failure?
Very hard to point to any one, and historians will always argue over this. But I mean, one of them clearly was the successful separation of powers and the idea that there was an orderly passing over of governance from the first president to the second, for instance. Part of Washington's genius was recognizing his unifying role. Had Washington decided to go back to his farm, maybe the American Revolution would have been different. But there were enough patriots in the early months and years of the American Republic that meant that actually the country did cohere. And whereas in France, you end up effectively, as you say, that France effectively, it was like a bungee jump. It was like they couldn't get away from the idea of a monarchical leader. And as you say, that led to Napoleon and then the Napoleon dynasty, which is effectively the same thing as having the Bourbons or the Habsburgs on your throne, or the Stuarts. They went to the Napoleons. This America managed to avoid, and as I say, it was by a hair's breadth at times, as we know from the early discussions of the founding fathers. But that ability to peacefully progress from the first to the second, third, and fourth president was one of the things that made the American experiment so unique.
So I want to take a broader look of history in a moment and talk about some other revolutions, but I think France is so worthy of study. So, after King Louis XVI was executed, and in fact, during that time period, you had the Jacobins, for example, extremists who looked to execute all of their political enemies. You had, as you mentioned, the Great Terror, which lasted, 5 years, where it was basically what was described by Dr. Drew. It was this mob mentality that existed for quite a while. And I know that's revolutionary France, and I don't seek to be hyperbolic, but again, I think it's worth drawing some lessons from history, even if they're not directly applicable to what happened to you in London this week, or whatever it may be. But we do have seemed to have fallen into, Dr. Drew described it as narcissistic, but there is, in my lifetime, and I would imagine in yours, Douglas, a greater reversion to mob mentality and sort of a lust for, if not violence, retribution that exists right now throughout Western society. Do you see parallels to what happened, or lessons from what happened in France?
Well, yes. I mean, there are some, definitely. There are always resonances from the French Revolution. I mean, one thing, of course, that happened was that the people in power, the king and his court, were utterly distant from the rest of the country. Louis was a weak man. He wasn't a particularly bad man, but he was a weak man. He wasn't like Louis XIV, who knew how to exercise power. Louis XVI was a ditherer. And of course, when you read now of the activities of the French court, I mean, the banalities of what they were engaging in, the frivolity and the simple separatedness of the court from the rest of the country. I mean, Versailles was wildly out of sync with Paris at the time, let alone all the rural areas where people were trying to scratch a living and very often failing. So that disconnect between the rulers and the ruled is something actually which traditionally democratic societies have tried very hard to avoid. And we have a way to avoid them, of course, which is in the form of democratic elections, where we, the people, get our say and nobody else can take it from us. And so whenever a democratic society needs to adapt, it has that great important release valve of elections. I would say that one of the dangerous things in recent years has been the growing perception in America and in other democracies that effectively the people, when they speak, are not listened to, and that this separate court, as you were, rules over them anyway, whichever way they vote at the ballot box. And that's really, I mean, we have heard that language in recent years, particularly in American politics. I think of sort of the deplorables and so on, that the sense that the political class doesn't like the people and would like to find a way to get around the people. The old joke, I can't remember who made it first, that that people have let the elected representatives down. We will need to replace the people. I think it was Brecht who made that joke first in the 20s. But in the 1920s. But it's yes, I do hear little echoes of that. And as for the bloodlust, one of the things that really is a remarkable element of the period of post-revolutionary France was this endless idea that you just sort of had to wade through enough blood and you would get to the nirvana. And what all that always misunderstood was that really once you've allowed the Pandora's box to open and the furies, to stretch the metaphor, to be released, what happens is something that no man or woman can contain. Once the use of violence enters politics, politics changes completely. Once you have people who want to pursue their goals through violence, politics changes. You mentioned this unfortunate incident earlier in the week, but I said in a piece today, I don't recognize my native country of Britain when an audience at a theatre in the heart of the West End can't turn up to an event because it's too dangerous to attend. I don't recognize a Britain where, for instance, the police don't immediately say, we will do everything in our power to keep this event safe. We will protect the public. And what it gives out, the opposite, is this terrible weakness, where, as I say, even the police seem to be fearful of the public. And the public aren't fearful of the police. They're certainly not the extremists in the British public. And I compared that to a famous event in the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, and when the IRA very nearly succeeded in assassinating her by putting a bomb in the wall of the hotel she was staying at in Brighton. It killed a number of her colleagues, very close friends of hers, seriously maimed the wife of one of her cabinet ministers. And she came very close to being killed herself. It was pure fluke that she wasn't. But she, the next day, stood in front of the British public and said, the conference will go on. We don't allow the men of violence, in that case the IRA, to dictate elected politics. And I don't hear that sort of determination or grit as much today as I would like. I see people being fearful of mobs in a way which, of course, only ever encourages them.
When you were describing a dithering leader and an elite class that is totally removed from the people, I mean, of course, there are always levels of extremity, but it's hard not to think about Washington, D.C. It's hard not to think about our current president in Joe Biden. And again, to emphasize, there are extremes, but as you mentioned, history isn't repetitive. It echoes. I'm not sure it even rhymes, but it echoes. It doesn't repeat. But there are lessons to learn from those echoes. Douglas, when I had fun with this topic and I was kind of like Googling revolutions, the frame that we put on our conversation today is top 5 revolutions. But I would make 2 interesting observations in putting this to you. Number one, when you Google that, it is shocking the number. Like, there are rankings out there, and I don't know from what type of source, but, they'll place the American Revolution 5th, and often the Haitian Revolution is 2nd, or the CCP is 3rd, or whatever they may be. And I don't know by what standard they're ranking revolutions, but what it occurs to me is if they're talking about the improbability or the success in throwing off an existing power, okay, maybe. Like a slave rebellion in Haiti it's a huge victory for the underdog, I guess, right? But what came after? That should be the measure of success. What did you replace the existing power structure with? And that's the success of the American Revolution. But the second thing, besides just these weird rankings, Douglas, is the American Revolution may be singular. I'm not sure you can come up with the top five. If I made you live in that format and say, give me your top five revolutions, most revolutions are, hey, we threw off what was, but didn't replace it with something that is better.
Oh, yes, you bet. I mean, it's extremely hard to come up with examples of revolutions that have been, first of all, successful, secondly, relatively peaceful, and thirdly, that have led to an improved society. And that's why, of course, the founding text of conservatism, conservative thought, Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, was such an important work, is such an important work, because Burke foresaw and witnessed his own predictions coming true, that what had been unleashed would always be worse than the situation that already existed. And France certainly demonstrated that in the years after 1789. There are some revolutions you could point to, but then you always get into dangerous corners of politics. For instance, I mean, in South American politics, endless revolutions and counter-revolutions and much more. The left in America in particular very often talks about the revolution in Chile and the specter of General Pinochet. And it's a very interesting one because Pinochet was a brutal man. He was, of course, a military leader. And I think it's estimated he killed around 5,000 of his political opponents. Has to be said, and I'm not by any means diminishing his crimes, but by revolutionary standards, historically, that isn't actually that high a number. And Chile today is probably in a better position than certainly a lot of its neighbors. But I mean, you wouldn't want to look back and say, therefore, this is to be celebrated because it's still, thousands of lives lost. The problem is, I notice that for ideological reasons, the left in particular celebrates revolutions far, far bloodier than that in Chile, and doesn't mind the blood that had to be waded through. I mean, in my own lifetime, only 15 years ago, a Labour Party MP in the UK said that Chairman Mao was a great historical hero. And when asked why, she said, well, he caused great advances in the agrarian economy of China. I think, well, yes. And then there was the 60 to 70 million people that he murdered along the way, either by directly murdering them or by starvation. So the left, I have to say, is especially blithe, in my view, at celebrating horrifically bloody revolutions, unimaginably bloody revolutions, which actually almost all of the time did not lead to an improvement in the society, either materially or socially.
The commonality, there's two commonalities I see when you analyze revolutions. One is the obvious, throwing off existing power structures. In the beginning, it was throwing off monarchies. In many cases, it was throwing off perhaps colonial powers. Sometimes it's throwing off a dictator. Whatever it may be, changing the existing power dynamic within a country. But the result, the vast majority of time, comes down to replacing it with chaos. And as I look at it, Douglas, it sort of becomes the prism through which you see how society is ordered, order or chaos. I've always been fascinated by the mindset of the World Economic Forum. I've always been fascinated by the mindset of the Klaus Schwab or Bill Gates viewpoint of what is the point of trying to engineer from on high some sort of utopia. But I do wonder if they look at the expanse of history and go, well, in their own minds, Douglas, they go, well, without order, be it a king, be it a party, be it a dictator, you're left with chaos. And so in order to avoid chaos, we will impose a utopic order in the vision we manifest here together at the World Economic Forum. I don't think I'm being charitable. I'm just trying to understand how it is they see the world and why there's an excuse to think beyond nation states into this utopic world globalist vision.
Well, I mean, it's a pretty dangerous game they're playing, in my view. It gets back to that thing of the ruler and the ruled having too large a gap between them. I mean, one of the interesting things about the emerging prominence of the WEF in recent years has been that there seems to be a greater and greater awareness of it among the general public in all of the world's democracies. And that rather, I think, perfectly legitimate feeling of who exactly appointed these people and why do they talk about us in such grandiose terms. And to quote a famous left-wing politician who put his finger on something quite good on this, one of the questions you have to ask anyone who has power is, how did you get it and who can take it away? And the question of who could take away power from Klaus Schwab, of course, is none of us, and not you, not me, and no member of the public. We just have him making very grand pronouncements about our collective future and making decisions that affect that future. I think I've always thought in every country that it is a deeply disturbing situation to be in, to have people making decisions over you who you cannot yourself do anything to get rid of. As I say, that's one of the geniuses of democracy is you can vote people in and you can vote them out.
I wanted to look up this tweet. It's by I think it's Klaus Schwab's right-hand man, but basically he laid out that he sees the prism as one between chaos and order, and I guess they have anointed themselves as the inheritors or the organizers of order. They put themselves clearly at the top of the pyramid, the World Economic Forum.
They're not wrong, by the way, to see all politics and everything else as being a battle between chaos and order. That's always the case. And the problem for them is, of course, that is one of the things that goes not between one person and another, but down the center of everyone. I mean, everyone has the simultaneously the capacity to admire order and the desire to create chaos. It's in all of us.
This conversation that I had with Dr. Drew, where he brought back up the French Revolution, he talked about Napoleon as essentially the antidote to what was happening in terms of this bloodlust and mob violence in France. And of course, as you point out, it's just a return to the mean. It was returned to a new authoritarian figure. But it was something else as well that Napoleon represented. He represented, for one thing, in France, sort of a national vision and a military expansionism. And that, I think, gave the populace an opportunity to find themselves unified once again on something. And that seems to be the great big challenge of the West right now. What unifies us, right? Either here in America or the West in general. What do we have anymore that we rally around? I think one of the few places that you and I kind of have a level of disagreement, I'm not sure, but you see much more virtue or utilitarianism in the Western military presence, for example, in Ukraine. I'm much more skeptical of military expansionism. But it is true that it is a way to unify. People are never more unified than when they are attacked from the outside. And even if they are the one doing the attack, even if they are the one expanding. And it's like Napoleon, by spreading his wings, and all of a sudden, I was watching this Alexander the Great documentary. The minute that his father is killed, right? And there's pretty decent historical evidence that he, if not his mother, was involved in the death of his father, who was the king of Macedonia. The first thing he does is blame the Persians. And now the court is unified, and now there's an outside force to which we were all, instead of dividing us inside of Macedonia on the Philippites versus the Alexandrians, it's now the Macedonians versus the Persians. And I just wonder, is this not a tool, and I'm not putting it in terms of virtue or vice, to unify us? As long as we are fighting over there, we're unified over here.
I don't know, because I mean, you're right. We probably do disagree on Ukraine. I don't think the problem is. I don't think. Well, first of all, Western forces aren't in Ukraine in any meaningful way. It's just a matter of arming the Ukrainians to fight for themselves, which has been since the beginning. The problem in Ukraine is Russian forces illegally invading it. And if Vladimir Putin withdrew tomorrow, the war would be over. But I've been in many countries at war, and yes, you're right. I mean, nothing unifies a country than being invaded, for instance. Expanding is another form of unification for sure, but the most unifying thing of all is what happens if you're invaded. I saw that when I was in Ukraine in the well, I can't remember what it was now, more than a year ago. And you've never seen a people more united. I would say that in Israel in recent months, Israel was tearing itself apart in recent years. Protesters on the streets every weekend over the judicial reform bill of the government. After the attacks of October the 7th, all that for now is put in the background because the country is unified in a war. Yes, of course. I mean, evasion makes all of these things seem, of course, as they are in the grand scheme, preposterous things to fall out about when you've got a matter of life and death in front of you. But by the way, one of the interesting things about Napoleon is that he's a historical figure who is a good example of the fact that you don't have to travel very many miles to see a totally different interpretation of him. Of course, if you go to his tomb in Paris, his grand and extraordinary tomb, you will see the reverence in which he is held in France. In Britain, he's seen quite differently. He's seen as a despot, a sort of proto-Hitler-like figure who tried to roll across Europe and then, of course, all the way into Russia, which is where he, like Hitler, failed. But it is very interesting. Some years ago, I was doing a project with a bunch of NATO generals, and the French general involved said to me one day over lunch, he said, is it true, Douglas, that in English schools they teach that Napoleon was a tyrant? And I said, well, I'm afraid to tell you they do. And he was, oh, mon Dieu. He couldn't believe it because for him and for France, Napoleon is the great hero. And by the way, that history is always still being litigated. In 1989, on the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution, President Mitterrand invited Margaret Thatcher to the celebrations in Paris, and she refused to go. She refused to go and said that she would not go because the revolution was not something to be celebrated. So even the small stretch of water that is the English Channel divides opinion on this figure even 200 years later.
President Mitterrand, who Joe Biden recently spoke to, we all know that, even though he passed away just several years ago. Out of curiosity, to the extent that it's acknowledged or discussed or taught, how is George Washington viewed in Great Britain?
I take a line from the writer Jessica Mitford on this one, who said that she was taught so little in her education about America and the American Revolution, as was I. I mean, I educated myself on it, but the general feeling seemed to be, as Jessica Mitford said, that the Americans had done something bad and we didn't talk about it anymore.
like misbehaving children.
The misbehavior, and we shouldn't talk about it. Quite wrong.
There are so many things I want to discuss with you, and I know it won't be the last time we talk. I've always enjoyed our conversations on colonialism, and I'm curious, like, why some colonial empires, and I know in modern day conversation, you're supposed to just dismiss them all as pure evil, but why some succeeded in ways that others failed, and what culturally made them different. But actually, in the time that we have together today, I wanted to ask you this, because this has been your focus for acutely for 6 months, but I know much longer as well. Israel, anti-Semitism. I'm speaking actually less about Israel and more about anti-Semitism here. When people think about anti-Semitism, I think that they obviously primarily think about the Holocaust. Then they think perhaps in modern day terms about what's happening maybe on the streets of London or maybe what's happening on American college campuses. But what I think they don't fully appreciate is the long historical roots of anti-Semitism, the fact that pogroms have been a part of history long before the Holocaust, and they spanned the expanse of Europe, for one. I mean, from Russia to Spain. Wherever there were Jews, there were pogroms. And now you can say, well, there's always bouts of violence, and every tribal group is pit against another tribal group, and there's always violence. But there does seem to be historically a unique cross-cultural, cross-global focus on Jews. What are, in your estimation, the roots of anti-Semitism?
Well, I follow the superb analysis Vasily Grossman makes halfway through his great 900-page novel Life and Fate, which traverses the 20th century's darkest period from Stalingrad to Treblinka, both of which places and battles and massacre sites Grossman himself visited and reported from as a journalist. In the middle of Life and Fate, he devotes 3 pages to the subject of anti-Semitism. I urge anyone interested in the subject to read it, because he says pretty much everything that needs to be said there. He points out that anti-Semitism is something that can be encountered in the Academy of Sciences and in the games that school children play in the yard. But as he says there, it always tells you not about the subject of the bigotry, but of the person who expresses the bigotry. As Grossman says, tell me what you accuse the Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of. They are effectively the mirror for the dispossessed, the disgruntled, the unhappy, and much more. In fact, I regard it, I've spoken to experts about this in the past, I regard it as being an expression of paranoia, among other things. People who are paranoid very often see secret workings, they see all sorts of plots against them, and people holding all the money, people holding all the power, and that sort of thing. And I think, by the way, actually, we were talking earlier about the WEF. I think some people actually do that with that to some extent. They overestimate to some degree what the WEF is, and sometimes overstate it. And of course, it's an issue of great concern. But I just say this because when the mind is burrowing for explanations for things, it very often lands on the nearest explanation at hand, and the Jews are very often the nearest explanation at hand. There is, of course, a very, very interesting thing about anti-Semitism, which is that it is, as I've said very often, a shape-shifting virus. I mean, in all these centuries, the Jews were blamed for having their own religion. They were blamed for being secular. They were blamed for being too religious and for being too non-religious. They were blamed for being too rich and also for being too poor. They were blamed for assimilating into society and not assimilating into society. There's another twist of that, of course, which is that they were blamed for not having a state and then attacked for having a state. All of this strikes me as being a sign that anti-Semitism is a sort of perennial vice of the human spirit. It's a very dispiriting idea.
The assimilation point is interesting, because I'm sitting here thinking, and I can't escape the why. Why? And I think that why requires one to look with a much broader view of history. Don't get caught simply in the 20th century. And you're not. You're talking about it as well, right? Because this is something that's happened for centuries, right? Primarily in Europe, we're talking about, but not exclusively in Europe. And
is a pretty
and I'm thinking here, there are other. I was thinking, okay, well, maybe it's that Jews were the other, right, in Europe. They had a different religion, they had a different ethnicity, but there were also Muslims in Europe. And I'll profess historical ignorance to the extent that violence was perpetrated on Muslims in Europe, wherever it may be. But Jews were more prevalent, I think, than Muslims throughout Europe. So why the focus on Jews?
Well, they were certainly more prominent. And this is one of the things, I mean, if you look at, for instance, pre-war Eastern and Central Europe, a country like Austria, Jews were overrepresented in, for instance, the banking world. Well, I mean, it's true as well that in the years after Adam Smith, Scots, I'm half Scots, so I noticed this myself, Scots were also very much involved in the banking world, overrepresented by their numbers as a proportion of the global population. But the prominence of Jews Of course, particularly in the eras where they were able to lend money. I'm thinking, for instance, of 15th century Spain and Italy and much more. They were at a level of prominence, and one of the interesting things is that Jews historically have always been at a great point of danger when they are prominent and weak. I'm thinking of, for instance, Spain in the 1400s. The problem was
Hmm.
not that Jews were prominent; it's that they were prominent and weak. That is, they didn't have the ability to protect themselves. They had no state, they had no army. So when King Ferdinand expelled them, and of course expelled the Muslims as well from Spain. But when and I mean there weren't that many Muslims in Europe at all really during this period. Only the Muslims in Spain because of the conquest of the southern part of Spain many centuries earlier. But the interesting thing is that, as I say, that what you see from that period is that Jews were prominent but weak. The Jews of Vienna before the before the First and Second World War were very prominent, but they were weak. And I think, at any rate, that this is one of the lessons of history for Jews, and certainly one of the lessons that Zionism teaches. This is what believes. This is what Theodor Herzl, when he had the dream of Zionism and wrote The Jewish State, had, which was when he saw, of course, Dreyfus being stripped of his honors in Paris in front of the mob in the 1890s. He sees this happen, and Herzl realizes we will never be protected, and we have to protect ourselves. And that's the birth of the Zionist movement, the
Right.
realization that Jews will never be protected by anyone else and therefore must protect themselves.
But and this will be the last thing we do together. This is fascinating. The why to me, because I think you're right on everything you say, but some of the violence and frequent violence on Jews predates even their prominence in commerce, certainly in banking. And I've read about that. Like, banking was seen as within Europe like a dirty profession a little bit. Like that's not. And then the Jews go in and they do it, and they do it very well, and it becomes, I get today, the world's top profession. But some of the violence predates the Jews being prominent in those professions, and that's why I keep coming back to assimilation, as you said, because I'm a big believer that your biggest strength is also your biggest weakness as an individual and as a society, Douglas. And the Zionist project, in studying it, one of the most fascinating things is it pulled people from all across the globe, right, from Russia and from France, and it brought them to Israel, and under the banner of a commonality, really only their religion, because there were cultural differences at that point. Certainly there was no linguistic commonality. They had to revive Hebrew, which is a stunning thing to have done. So they had all these differences, and the only thing they had in common really was their religion. And I'm wondering if that separation within Europe, no, we will maintain our Jewish neighborhood. Again, this is the strength that helped create Israel. Was it the thing that drew the ire of Europeans across different countries, that these people stay to themselves and don't assimilate and celebrate their own religion? Is that why they became the scapegoat for every problem?
Well, first of all, of course, it wasn't always the case that the Jews chose to self-segregate, as you see if you go to
Right.
the ghetto in Venice. The Jews were put into a specific part of the city and locked in overnight each night. By the way, a rather sad fact of life now is that if you go to the Jewish ghetto in Venice, it's protected by armed police because it's a target like every other Jewish site in Europe, and indeed the wider West. Um, it's of course the religious element was one of the deepest undertows. The idea that the Jews killed Christ, which of course it was a sort of was a claim that went through Christendom for the best part of 2,000 years. It wasn't until actually the aftermath of World War II that I can't remember which pope it was, but issued the encyclical absolving the Jews of responsibility for the death of Christ. And but that it was that led to pogroms on Easter Sundays in the 15th
Mm-hmm.
century and many other periods in Europe, across Europe, when the pulpit fulminated and the Jewish businesses were attacked. By the way, just add one other thing. You're completely right about the extraordinary unifying, and I mean, it's a miracle in my view, the unifying of Jewish people from around the world in Israel. One of my favorite books, Stefan Zweig's The World of Yesterday, includes his meetings with Theodor Herzl in Vienna in the early 1900s. And he was there at Herzl's funeral as well, and it's a very moving description of how thousands and thousands of Jews from all across Europe, from Russia, all flooded into Vienna for the funeral, and it was a massive pre-state occasion. There's one other thing I wanted to say very quickly, Will, by the way, just picking up on one thing
Sure.
earlier, which just might be worth throwing in. We didn't talk much today, but we should on another occasion, about one of the very, very interesting elements of revolution, which young people in particular always have to be reminded of. I mentioned earlier that constant desire for the refining fire, the wading through blood to get to the point of perfection. And one of my favorite stories about this can be found in a really, really remarkable book I much recommend. I'm just about to forget the author's name. She's a British woman writer, and she did a very good book a number of years ago called Petrograd 1917. And it's all first-hand accounts from the members of the public, from foreign ambassadors and diplomats, from every imaginable angle, first-hand accounts of what was going on in St. Petersburg in the immediate aftermath of the revolution that was so catastrophically brought by Lenin when he got on the train to the Finland station. And my favorite story, many stories in that book, which are just chilling to read about. It's all a reminder of the fact that the people who dream of the violence getting you to a better place should always remember stories like this. In the days immediately after the revolution, of course, the police had been disbanded, all the Tsarist authorities had been killed or chased into hiding, and much more. So the question came up, and all American revolutionaries of the modern era should consider this. The question then, only then, came up of how do we ensure safety or security, and how do we police? Maybe we do need some structure. And there's a story that is told in that book, a true story of people on a tram or bus in St. Petersburg, and there's a woman on the bus who suddenly starts screaming, a rather distinguished looking woman, or she has a rather smart coat on, and she's lost her purse. Her purse has been stolen, and she accuses the young man beside her, who sort of looks like a bank clerk. She accuses him of stealing it, and he is absolutely outraged and adamant that of course he hasn't stolen her purse, but she insists she doesn't have it on her. He's standing beside her. He must have stolen it. The revolutionary guards, authorities such as they are, the bus stops, they try to work out what to do with the situation, and what they do is they take the young man off the bus and they shoot him in the head. Just after this happens, the woman who'd lost her purse finds that it has fallen through the lining of her coat to the bottom of the inside of her coat, and she realizes this. And then there's a question of what to do with her. So they take her off the bus and they shoot her in the head as well. Problem solved.
Wow.
The point is that what the kid on an American campus who celebrates revolution doesn't realize is that you allow all of the furies of the world out. And you might think you would know. A final anecdote on this. My favorite quote, Leonard Bernstein's in much in people's minds at the moment. In Tom Wolfe's great seminal essay, A Radical Chic, about the Black Panther Party at the Bernstein's apartment, Bernstein and the other guests are being lectured at by these Panthers and being told what they're going to do when they overthrow the current regime in America. And Otto Preminger, who is there, keeps saying to the lead Panther, but what are you going to do after your revolution? What will you do? And eventually, the Panther is sort of infuriated and says, you can't put a blueprint on the future, man. And Leonard Bernstein leans forward and says, you mean you're just going to wing it? Now, that's the thing.
I think
all revolutionaries always think, we'll know what to do. Let's just get the revolution. Let's just overthrow. We'll sort out all the other details next. They never have.
Yeah.
They never.
That's a perfect place to end. Destruction is easy. Creation is hard. And I think that's a perfect place to end, because there may not be a top 5 list of revolutions. It truly may be, and I know it sounds like a patriotic American thing to say, but it truly may be a singular event of able to throw off the shackles of power and replace it with something better. Douglas Murray, there's so many more things I'm looking forward to talking to you about next time. Always respect and appreciate your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Pleasure to be with you.